Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to another DxO webinar. I'm your host, Photo Joseph, and today we are going to be exploring a little bit more about the latest app from DxO PureRAW. Now, if you haven't seen PureRAW yet at all, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what it is and how it works and why you'd use it and how you'd use it and all that good stuff, which is going to be a bit of chit chat before we dive into it. And then today, I'm really going to be focusing on a bunch of before and afters of a variety of images. I will show you the workflow from start to finish, but given that each image takes time to process, I have a bunch of different samples that are already processed that we're just going to look at some before and afters on. And of course, I do want to open this up to Q&A at any time. So throughout the presentation, if you have questions about PureRAW, by all means, drop them into the chat. Lori is in here with me. She's going to filter out your comments, your questions, and put them up in a nice organized fashion for me so that I will do my best to address all of those as we go. So with that said, today's presentation, and hopefully you can see my screen right now, recovering older camera files, fixing small sensor issues, and more using DxO PureRAW. So again, I am going to be focusing largely on some older images off some old Canon cameras. I used to shoot Canon a long time ago, so I've got some older files there. I shoot largely, well, I shoot entirely Lumix cameras now, largely micro four thirds. So you got the smaller sensors, which of course don't perform as well in low light as their larger sensor counterparts, with a quarter of the surface area to work in. So we can, we're going to see here just how nicely we can clean up some of the noise generated by those sensors using PureRAW. Again, just the premise of what we're doing, the whole idea of PureRAW, it uses, I'm just going to read what's on here, it uses smart technology to fix the 7 problems that affect all RAW files: demosaicing, denoising with DeepPRIME AI, moiré, distortion, chromatic aberrations, unwanted vignetting, and a lack of sharpness. So we're going to go through a bunch of examples here. And I will admit that some of these problems, I have a hard time finding images in my library that exhibit these, because I've been shooting for a long time and I tend to try not to encounter these problems in my files. So some of the more unique specific things we may not go very precisely on, but you are going to see some really incredible changes through the images that I am going to show you. And then of course, I encourage you to download the trial on your own system and see just exactly what you can do. Also, one more thing I will throw out before we jump into the demo. A lot of times people want to know if their camera is supported. The easiest way to find out is to head over to the DxO website. Lori's going to drop this URL for you in the chat as well. I believe it's dxo.com/supported-cameras, supported-cameras, pretty sure that's it. Again, she'll drop the link in there to confirm it. But if you go there, you'll see a list of all the supported cameras that can be processed with PureRAW. With that in mind, let me just do a little bit of a kind of high-level spiel of what PureRAW is. Let's get this opened up here and talk about how it works, what it does, and why you might want to consider using it. So what is it? PureRAW is a raw processing engine. That's basically it. That's all it does. It is not a photo editor. It is not a catalog tool. All it is a raw processor. And you might think, well, hold on, why would I need that? Because I already open my photos in Photoshop or Lightroom, or I open them in Camera Raw, or I open them in Photolab even, or I open them in Apple Photos, or I open them in Capture One, or any number of programs out there, and those all handle raw files just fine. Why would I need anything else? Well, here's the thing. See, PureRAW is born of Photolab, and for those of you who've used Photolab, you know that Photolab has an absolutely incredible raw processing engine. It adds 2 things to the mix that you don't get out of normal raw processing engines. First of all, you have a unique profile that is applied to every single photo that is open from every single possible camera and lens combination. Now, admittedly, there are some camera and lens combinations that aren't covered, but over 60,000 possible camera and lens combinations are covered. Each camera and lens combination has an individual little file, a little DxO optics module, and you'll see in the demo here how we access that. And those little optics modules get downloaded as needed on demand to process your photo taken with your camera and your lens. And those are very precise, very unique profiles that are created with that exact camera and lens model in a laboratory, where DxO takes that camera and lens, they shoot it through a whole variety of test situations inside the lab and out, and then develop a profile, this DxO optics module, that corrects for all the things you saw in the slides. Let me pull that back up again. It corrects for demosaicing, it corrects for denoising, it corrects for moiré, distortion, chromatic aberrations, and all these other things. And ironically, the older and kind of lesser quality, let's say, that your lens and or sensor is, the more benefit you are likely to see from PureRAW. It takes those older files, it takes those cheaper lenses, and it makes them look better, which is pretty cool. The ability to be able to take some older files or take some cheap lenses, maybe a kit lens that your camera came with that, you know, maybe you like the focal length, but it's just not that good of a lens. You take some pictures and you process them through PureRAW and you go, whoa, it's almost like I went out and bought some really fancy new glass. It's remarkable what you get out of it. So that's the first additional thing that you're getting out of the DxO RAW engine, which is part of Photolab and is also in PureRAW. You get that optics module. The second thing you get is the incredible denoising. If you've ever used PureRAW, if you've ever used Photolab before, then you'll recall that there is something called PRIME. PRIME denoising is an absolutely phenomenal level of denoising. If you've taken your high ISO photos and processed them through any other app and then put them through PRIME, you go, wow, PRIME is definitely better. You're getting a much higher quality denoising. Well, with Photolab 4 that was released earlier this year, late last year, whenever, time is nebulous these days, whenever that was released, there was a new generation of PRIME called DeepPRIME. And DeepPRIME is just the next level of the PRIME D algorithm, and it is phenomenally just amazing. It's even better than PRIME, obviously, which is kind of hard to believe. When you saw the comparison, if you've seen those before, you just go, wow, it's even taken to a whole new level. And again, those higher ISO photos just get whole new life breathed into them. It's especially useful, and I'll just make this point now in case I forget to make it while I'm doing the demo. It's especially useful when you're out shooting. If you know that you have DeepPRIME in your toolkit, then you know that you can allow yourself to shoot at a higher ISO, which might mean the difference between getting a shot and not getting the shot. Maybe it's a handheld situation where you can't put the camera on a tripod or your subject is moving, so you can't shoot for a low ISO, long shutter speed exposure. You have to shoot at a 60th or 125th of a second, which means in the lighting situation, you have to shoot at 16,000 ISO or 25K or some crazy high ISO where you would normally not want to do that because the picture's not going to be good enough. But knowing that you have this tool in your arsenal allows you, it frees you up to shoot at those higher ISO settings, knowing that you'll be able to still get a phenomenal image out of it. So PureRAW on its own is everything I just talked about. It is the raw processing with the optics modules, with the DeepPRIME denoising, all in a single standalone app, where Photolab is that plus a full suite of editing tools. This is just the raw processing. So the idea here is that you would use PureRAW in conjunction with whatever tools you're using today. So if you want to use, or if you are using Photolab, then you don't need PureRAW because you've already got the same capability there along with all the other editing tools. But a lot of people, of course, are not using Photolab. They're using Lightroom, they're using Photoshop, they're using camera, Apple Photos, Capture One, that was the one I was losing. Capture One, you're using whatever other asset management tools / photo editing tools that you like, that you love, and you don't want to get rid of those. You don't want to stop working with those, but you wouldn't mind getting a better raw file. If not for all of your raw files, at least for those occasional ones where you go, ooh, this photo is really special to me. I want to make it even better. Or this photo, it'd be great if it wasn't so noisy. I want to try and make it better, and that's where PureRAW comes in. So I will show you the workflow very briefly, and then like I said, we're going to really focus on looking at different images. So with all that out of the way, let's jump into a workflow. I'm going to start in Lightroom Classic. I'm actually only going to use Lightroom Classic today unless we need to jump into Photoshop for something else. There's really, no matter what tool you're using, the method is the same for getting your photos into PureRAW. If you are just organizing your photos in the Finder or in Windows Explorer, you just drag the photo into PureRAW. If you are using any other asset management tool, like Lightroom Classic here, you would right click on the image and say Show in Finder to reveal that original. Of course, it opened up a new window. Here we go. To open up or reveal that original raw file, And here it is right here. It says cr2.cr2. This is an old Canon file. And that's the file that we want to edit. And I would then drag and drop that into my editor. So just right click, reveal, drag it in, reveal in Finder, reveal in Explorer, and drag it in. If you are, however, using a cloud-based tool, meaning Lightroom CC, it's just called Lightroom now, but Lightroom CC, or if you're using Apple Photos, both of which are cloud-based, then there is no reveal in Finder command or reveal in Explorer because the photo may not exist on your computer. It may only be in the cloud. Instead, you would export it. There's an export command in both of those apps that would allow you to export the original file, export the raw file. And it is for RAW. PureRAW is all about working with raw files. You can't process TIFFs or JPEGs through it. It does require the raw file to do what it does. So just to get that out of the way. So anyway, right click, reveal in, and there's the image. And now I can drag and drop this in. So this one's already been processed, but I would just drag and drop this in. So I could go over to PureRAW. You can Command Tab to drag and drop. You can make your windows a little bit smaller, more manageable, but I simply drag and drop this in. And once you do that, it's going to prompt you to download the DxO optics module that is needed to process that image. So in this case, I can see that this photo was shot on a Canon 1DS Mark III with the Canon 16 to 35 f2.8 lens. So great. So that's a really good lens. It's a really good body. It should be a really good image. Shouldn't need a whole lot of help, but we're going to be able to give it, maybe a little bit of extra help of what we can do with PureRAW. So that's one way to go about doing it. If you are using, I'm going to cancel that and make this window nice and big again. If you are using Lightroom Classic on a Mac, and this is unique to Lightroom Classic on the Mac, then you can do a really cool drag and drop workflow. So let's say this image here is the next one I'm going to work with. And I'm going to grab this photo here and just click and drag on it here in Lightroom. And then I'm going to Command Tab over to PureRAW and drop it into PureRAW, and it pops up that same download module for the download window for the optics module. So with that in mind, now I'm going to go ahead and download that. So I just click on download selection. It downloads the optics modules that are needed for those photos. I click on save, and now I'm ready to process. So this is the photo that I want to start with. Let me go back over to Lightroom real quick, and let's zoom in close to this and take a close look at it in Lightroom. This photo is, let's see here, shot on a Lumix GX8, so that is a micro four thirds sensor. It's this is probably four-year-old camera, I think, so not crazy old or anything, but it is micro four thirds, so it's a smaller sensor. It was shot on a good lens, great lens, like a 100 to 400 lens. It's a very good lens, smaller sensor, but it was shot at a very high ISO of 25,600. So right there, we're seeing just an incredible amount of noise in this image because it was shot at such a high ISO. Now, that's not to say that we can't fix this in Lightroom. I can go into Lightroom and I can go down to my noise, let's see, where are we? There we go, noise reduction sliders, and I can play with these and try and make it better. I'm not going to do it yet. I'll come back to this later, but I can do this to try and make it better. But how much better can I really make it in Lightroom? Well, what we want to do is process this through PureRAW, and then I'm going to take that back into Lightroom, and we're going to do a side-by-side comparison. So I've already dragged this over to PureRAW, so here it is in PureRAW, ready to go. With that image selected, I click on Process Photos, and it brings up this dialog where I make the only choice that I have to make in PureRAW, which really is no choice at all. Honestly, just leave it alone. But you can choose if you want to do less denoising. You can do the HQ denoising, the high quality kind of base level denoising, the old school prime denoising, or the new DeepPRIME denoising, which is far more efficient, far better. Honestly, just leave it there. Output format, you can output a DNG or a JPEG. Now, outputting a JPEG doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless all you're trying to do is just get a bunch of pictures to send to somebody. But really, it's all about the DNG. And this is a critical part of understanding this workflow. Even though I am handing a raw file to PureRAW and it is processing the raw file, what I'm getting out of it is also a raw file. It's just a better raw file. And this is a really important point. I want to make this point super, super clear. You are not getting a TIFF or a PNG or a PSD or a JPEG. You are getting a raw DNG file. And here's why this matters. Here's what's really important about this. A lot of folks use software like, say, Capture One for a very specific reason. They love the color processing of it. They love the way that their photos look when they're processed by Capture One, or when they're processed by Adobe's ACR, or when they're processed by Apple Photos. This is a large reason that people choose a particular raw engine. It's the color science or the color engineering that goes into that. Remember, when you're talking about a raw photo, the raw image, the raw file, I hesitate to even call it a raw photo because it's not a photo. It's just data. It's just information. That raw data needs to be processed to be turned into a photo, into an image that we can actually see. I like to equate it to the chef in the kitchen and a bunch of ingredients. You hand 5 different chefs the exact same ingredients and say, go make me a chocolate cake. Every single one of them is going to make a chocolate cake, but they're all going to be different. They're going to look a little different. They're going to taste a little different. Same ingredients, different chefs means a different chocolate cake. That's what we're getting with our photos. When you send a raw file to a raw processor, whether you're sending it to Adobe's, to Apple's, to Phase One's, whatever, you're sending it to a different one, what you're getting back is your same photo, but it's going to look a little bit different. So that is where PureRAW comes in. It takes those ingredients, and instead of handing you back a finished image that has a particular look to it, all it's really doing is cleaning up those raw ingredients, giving you better, cleaner, raw ingredients to work with, so that when your processing engine, again, whichever one you're using, grabs a hold of it, it's got something better to start with. But here's the critical component of this. What PureRAW is not doing is applying color science to your photo. So you're allowing your raw processing engine of choice that you normally use, you're going to let it still do all the color processing. It's just going to do that color processing to a better raw file, to a cleaner raw file. So you still get the look of the Adobe RAW, the look of Capture One. You get those looks, but you just have it applied to a better quality file to begin with. So super, super important part of that. So with that in mind, going back to this dialog here, we're now looking at a format of either JPEG, again, largely not something you ever want to do, or DNG, and DNG is what we want because that's going to give us that raw file that will give us that really clean, better image back inside of whatever tool we're using. So there we've got it. DeepPRIME, DNG, last choice, destination folder. By default, it's going to go into a folder called DxO in the same folder as the original images. Great place to leave it. If you want, you can choose a custom location, but leaving it there is perfectly fine. So we click on process, and this is going to tear through. We're going to see a dialog progress bar at the bottom that shows us how long it's going to take. It's pretty quick. I am admittedly on a very, very fast and powerful machine here, so it really does go through quite quickly, but there we go. Now that's done. All right, so now I have 3 choices. I can just go look at the image in the Finder. I can view the results here in PureRAW, or I can directly export it to wherever I want to go next. I'm going to view the results. You don't have to. I just want to show this in here, and I want to show a side-by-side in here. Let's take a look at this. And oops, not hit my shortcut there. Let's take a look at this at a 1-to-1. So what we're looking at here, on the left-hand side is the original, and the right-hand side is the DNG. There is obviously a massive, massive difference in here. Now, I want to be clear. I want to be totally fair about this. What we're seeing right now does look different than what we saw over in Lightroom. And the reason for that is the image on the left that you're looking at now has no denoising applied to it at all. So you're seeing a huge amount of color noise in here. If we go back over to Lightroom, you'll see that color noise is gone in here. So that color noise does get removed in Lightroom by default. In fact, I think if I take this color slider down, yeah, I can remove it, but this is not the default way. So there's basically the same look between the two, but that is not the default. The default in Lightroom is to remove that color noise, and it does a perfectly fine job of doing that. So what we're seeing here is the raw file without any denoising applied. But what we're seeing on the right is the DeepPRIME PureRAW image, and it clearly looks a lot better. So now let's take this one and send it over to Lightroom. So let's close this, and then I'll go to the export dialog, and from here I can choose where I want to continue to work with my image. Do I want to open it in Photoshop? Do I want to work on it in Lightroom? That's the CC version. Do I want to open it in Apple Photos or Affinity Photo? Or I can choose any custom software that I want in here that's on my system and send it off to there. In this case, I'm going to send it to Lightroom Classic. If this was the first time I had used this image, if I had not started in Lightroom, if I wanted to, I have the ability to export the original raw file as well. So if I wanted to, let's say, process the photos and then take both the original raw and the DNG into my software of choice, I can do that. Of course, it's already there in Lightroom, so I'm not going to choose that. I'll just click on export. And what this does is trigger the import dialog in Lightroom Classic. It's not an import module. It's just the standard default Lightroom import dialog. You'll see that that photo is already selected there, and it's going to add this to the database. And that's it. That's all I got to do. So I click on import, and it adds this in. It'll take me to the previous import view in the catalog, so we see that image there. But here's the really cool thing, because so I've got all my photos in this thing called demo photos, this folder called demo photos. I have the choice selected here to show photos in subfolders This photo is living inside of this DxO folder. Ultimately, what that means is when I click on my demo photos folder here, we are seeing both the original DNG and the new, the original raw file and the new DNG side by side. And you can see down here, the file name, that's the DNG and that's the original raw. So let's go into the develop module and compare these side by side. So there again is the original raw, and there is the new DNG. Let me go into the split screen view to really drive this point home. Drop this here, position these the same, and now you can see the side by side just how phenomenally different it is. Now, we want to be totally fair here. We want to give Lightroom its chance to do the best that it possibly can. So I'm going to go over here to my noise reduction sliders, and I'll start dragging it up. And I'll just drag it up, and I'll drag it up, and I'm going to try and get this to the point where it looks like the same level of denoising is happening. And by the time I get even close to it, we can see this has just become a big watercolor-like mush. It is just a completely different photo, really nowhere near what the original photo was. I can add a little contrast and try and bring some of that life back, but I mean, there we're basically talking about the difference there, side by side there. That is a phenomenal difference. Look at the detail in the whiskers. Look at the detail around the eye, the sharpness around the eye. That's a big part. Look at the, what is that, the cornea? I don't even know. Cornea, I think that's right. That edge right there, how sharp that is. Look at it up here. It's bumpy, it's soft, it's crunchy. And look at the fur in here. There's no detail in the fur on the right, but look on the left. Just phenomenal amount of detail here on the left. So it really is an incredible difference. So now that I've done this, let me get out of the compare mode and let's look at the DNG file. Now that I've got this DNG, now I can go ahead and do whatever I want to do to my photo, right? I can continue processing it just like a normal raw file. So it's a little bit flat still, so maybe I'll add a little contrast into this. Maybe I do a little cropping, whatever, and I can make this photo look phenomenal. And it's pretty hard to believe that this was shot at, what was it, 25,000 ISO. I think that was right, 25,600 ISO on a micro four thirds camera, and yet this is what we're getting out of it. So that ability to save your older or high ISO photos like that is just absolutely phenomenal. So I've got a bunch more photos to show you, some before and afters that we're going to go through. I'm going to jump over to the questions real quick here because I see a couple have already come up. And someone, first of all, is saying, not a question, but just an FYI, in Windows, you can drag and drop to PureRAW from Adobe Bridge. Oh, that's great. That is great to know. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know why it doesn't work out of Lightroom, but apparently it does out of Adobe Bridge. So cool. Thank you for sharing that. That's very good to know. I don't have a PC in-house, so I don't ever get to test these things, but that's good to know. Thanks. Next one says, in Lightroom, I find it's not necessary to export the image from PureRAW. It creates the image in a DxO subfolder already, so I can just go back to Lightroom and click on Synchronize Folder. Oh, correct. And voila, the image is there. That is correct. Is this the same as the file as image export? Absolutely. So here's what they're saying. Let me actually show this because I think that's actually a really good, that's a great workflow. Actually, it's funny. I've never really thought about that workflow. I'm so in the mindset of hitting the export button, but you're 100% right. So let's do this. I'm going to go back into the library and let me find an image that has not been processed. Okay, so these two images here I have not yet processed. So let's say I take these two photos and we go over to PureRAW and I drop these in. And let's see, those are shot on different sensors. We'll download those, or shot on different lenses, and save that. Okay, so now I've got these two photos here. I'm actually going to clear these out of here. Let's get rid of this one. Actually, I'm not going to bother. Anyway, so let's see here. All right, I'm going to grab these two photos, not that one that's already been processed, and I'll process those. So leave everything at default and click on process. And instead of doing the export, I will just go over to Lightroom and synchronize the folder. I think that's absolutely brilliant. What this means is that you can do kind of one image here, a couple images there, play with different ones, and then once you've made your final decisions of which one you want to keep and which ones you don't want to keep, then you can synchronize the folder. So we're just going to say, we're just going to close this, not going to do anything. And now I'll go back over to Lightroom. And let's see here, the DxO folder here is the one that needs to be synced. So I right click on that and choose synchronize folder and import new photos. I can show the import dialog or not. We'll just say import the two new photos, hit synchronize, and just like that, there's those two new photos. So I go back to the demo photos collection and there they are. That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you for pointing that out. That is brilliant. Now that that's shown, let's actually take a look at these two photos because these are two pretty good photos to see the differences on. Let's see, that's the DNG. There we go. There's the original RAW. So let's just do some more side-by-sides here. Let's do that because that's just a great way to preview these. So on the right, the original image in Lightroom, and on the left, the PureRAW processed. And I mean, just look at this is a great photo because look at the detail in the worker's hand, all the wrinkles, the incredible wrinkles that are in here that we are still seeing on the left. And yet here on the right, let me try and clean this image up in Lightroom. Noise reduction, luminance slider, we'll just crank that up. And by the time we get anywhere near that level of noise reduction, we've just lost an incredible amount of detail in there. So that is a phenomenal difference. Also, look at things like the shadow area in here. Here you see just basically no noise whatsoever. But here on the right, even with all this denoising, we're still seeing a fair amount of noise showing up in there, which is really, really incredible. The flowers, look at the color in the flowers, the color saturation even. Over here on the left, in the shadow, in the darker areas, it's beautiful. It's a nice, smooth gradient. It's very clean. Over here on the right, even remember, this has the denoising already applied in Lightroom. We're seeing a lot of noise in the shadows in there. It's a very bumpy transition. It's not anywhere near as smooth. It's truly remarkable difference in there. Okay, let's keep looking at some other examples in here. I'm going to just kind of go through some older photos here, and let's go to the library view, and I'm just going to go through some of my older photos, and these are photos that I pulled out of my archives that I wanted to see the differences of. Now, as I toggle back and forth between these two, you can see there is the original photo and there is the DeepPRIME. Now, I remember shooting this. Remember very specifically, I did not have a tripod, but I found something to rest my camera on so I could do a long exposure. So it's not crazy long. Let's see here. It's a 20th of a second, ISO 800. This is a full frame 5D. Is full frame? Yeah, Canon 5D's full frame. 14mm lens, nice wide lens. This is a really good lens, right? This is a Canon 14mm aspherical lens, really good quality, but you still get some inherent distortion in it. And here we're looking at the raw file, and you don't look at this and think, oh, that's totally distorted. But when we toggle over to the PureRAW version, you see how it's flattened that out. It's taken some of that bend out of the image and it's made it look a little bit better. Now the image is still crooked because, as I was saying, I didn't have a tripod, so I found something else to rest this on. And the only way to rest it was for the camera to be a little bit crooked. Just top tip, remember, if you have to rest your camera on something, it's going to be crooked, let it be crooked. You can fix it later. That's easy enough. Just go to the develop module and just get out of the preview mode here, the side-by-side mode. Go here and straighten that out. Remember, this is not a big deal. It's not hard to do. So we just straighten that out, and now we've got that perfectly straight image with the straightened view out of PureRAW, and it just looks incredibly clean. And if we zoom in close on this, actually, you know what? Let me do this. Let me do close view. I did not do this before, but I know that the highlight detail in here is fragile. It's tenuous. So let's take a look at it. See how well that comes through on there. Yeah, we're definitely seeing additional detail. Look at the texture in the horse sculptures up here. Look at the texture in the what do you call that? The not engraving. Whatever that's called, the sculpt, I don't even know, there's a word for this. You can see just an incredible amount more detail on the left than you're getting on the right. Virtually no noise, not a really high ISO photo, 800 on a full frame, so it's not bad, but we can see, look at the pillars here, how nice and clean that is, but on the right, how much more noise is in there. So really quite the difference in there. So this is what I wanna do. I just wanna go through some old photos and show you the differences. Let's go to, so I want to make sure I'm choosing the raw first. Here we go. Here's the raw file first. We're going to start with this one. This is in Slovenia. This is outside of a winery. You can go in for some wine tasting here. Really just a casual snapshot. You know, obviously very much the end of the evening in here, and some nice warm glow coming from these buildings. The folks out front. Not terribly sharp. We zoom in close. This is the original raw file that we're looking at here. Let's take a look at the metadata on this. Let's see here. This is 1DS Mark III, a 50mm f1.2 L lens. So again, very good lens on here, very sharp lens, very good camera. So really there should be nothing wrong with the photo, but it was shot at ISO of 3200. 1DS Mark III is a 10+ year-old camera. So, you know, yeah, it's a limit to what we can do. We can see people are a bit soft down here. Quite a lot of noise in the details in here as I pan this around, a lot of noise in the sky. All right, cool. Now let's look at the PureRAW version. Pull that up. I mean, look at the difference. Let's go back and forth between these. It's phenomenal. Look at the sky. Look at the sky difference here. Just there's no noise in the sky anymore. Look at this version here on the roof, all the noise in the roof. It's gone. It's just gone. Let's pan down over to here. Let's look at this part of the image. I guess I have to do this. Pan these back and forth there. Really, really remarkable difference. Let's go and zoom back out of these two and just toggle back and forth between them. We're getting rid of a lot of the vignetting. Oops, went too far, wrong way. There we go. As I go back and forth, I'm just going to keep toggling back and forth so you get a before and after. And look at the bottom of the frame, how much darker the original is. There's the original versus the PureRAW version. That is the in-lens vignetting. Was this shot wide open? It was. It was just shot at f1.2, so shot wide open, which, as you're probably aware, when you shoot wide open, especially on a really large aperture lens, you often get vignetting. Just basically, it's just the lens barrel. You are seeing the edge of the lens barrel in the photo causing this vignetting. And yet the PureRAW software has removed that for us. Also, look at the top of the tower up here, the top of the steeple. As I go to the original, it has a little bit of a curvature to it, and here it's straightened out. So even with a lens as good as the 50mm f1.2 L mount lens, this is like a $2,000 lens. This is an incredible lens. It is still getting better, being made better with this tool. Let's see here. Let me go to one more image to look at it before and after, and then I'm going to hit some more questions that are coming up in there. All right, this one, what is this? Also 1DS Mark III, the 16 to 35mm lens again. So same lens that we saw earlier somewhere. Anyway, so same lens we've seen before. This is shot at f2.8, so wide open on the 16 to 35. Also all the way out at 16mm, looking at that metadata. ISO of 3200, so not massively high ISO, but pretty high ISO. And if I just toggle the back and forth between these two, again, we're seeing the vignetting correction. That's a big part of this. There is clearly some distortion happening in the image. This is very much a forced perspective, how I shot this photo sitting down on the ground, looking up at them to get that view. But really, we're seeing a remarkable improvement in the distortion around the edges. But let's go in close. Let's go in close and take a look at our friend's face in here. Let's go into the develop. Actually, I can do this in library view. Leave it in library view and do the split view. Okay, this time we have on the left, we have the original, on the right, the DNG, but look at the skin in there. Look at how much smoother it is on the right. You would never guess this was shot at 3200 ISO. Look at his uniform, how much noise there is here on the left and how clean it is on the right. The belt, his belt buckle, the detail that we're seeing on the right that we're not seeing on the left, really absolutely remarkable difference in there. Here's another example here. Look at this is the bird's nest, by the way. This is the Beijing Olympics in 2008. Is that right? Yeah, 2008. This is the bird's nest. Look at the texture in here, all the noise that we're seeing in there, and on the right, it's just totally gone. Totally gone. It's pretty remarkable there. Okay, let's see here. There's a couple more questions coming up. Let's see if I can address some of these. All right. How to use pictures with a manual lens. In my example, I have a pic with a Samsung NX1 and a Samyang 8mm. There's no pop-up which asks for camera lens. All right, okay. So here's what's happening here. Remember in the beginning, I was explaining how there are over 60,000 unique DxO optics modules for every possible camera and lens. Many possible, let's use the word many possible camera and lens combinations. The only way this works is if the software can identify what the camera and what the lens were. So if you're shooting with a lens that is a fully manual lens, whether it's a lens like the Samyang that you're talking about here, or it is a lens that was a vintage lens that was adapted, modified, if there's no electronic contacts on the back of that lens to communicate to the camera what it was shot with, then this doesn't work, because there's no way for the software to know what lens that was shot with. If you open up that photo in Photoshop or Lightroom or anywhere, and you look at the metadata, you will likely see the camera's metadata, but the lens metadata will be blank because there is no metadata because the camera didn't know what lens was on there. So that's an unfortunate reality of this process. Manual lenses can't be worked with this way. Sorry, that's just the way it is. It's just the byproduct of how this is done. Next question is, if I have a picture taken with a completely automatic lens, which doesn't get recorded in the metadata, will I be able to still use the noise reduction capabilities? So again, if it's not recorded in the metadata, then no, but if it's, you're saying completely automatic, that should be recorded in the metadata. I don't know of any kind of automatic lens that wouldn't be recorded. feel free to elaborate on that question, like what type of lens that might be. But if there, at the end of the day, if there is no metadata, it's not going to be there. To like really kind of clarify that point, let's just say that you took a normal electronic contact lens, your normal modern camera lens, and you put the lens on, but you didn't close the lens all the way. You know, you rotate it on and it doesn't quite lock, but your camera still allows you to take a picture because depending on the camera you have, like I know with my older Lumix cameras, there's an option to allow the camera to take a picture even without a lens. Without a lens, the idea being that you put on a manual lens, the camera by default goes, oh, there's no lens here, it won't let you take a picture. You can override that. More of the modern cameras, they don't even bother with that override. They just assume that you know that you've put a lens on there. You know, don't take a picture with without a lens on there. But either way, if your camera allows you to take a picture without a lens and you put a lens on but it didn't lock all the way, the contacts didn't line up, then that metadata won't be there. Of course, you also wouldn't be able to control autofocus or the aperture, so you'd probably figure it out, but that's just an illustration to drive the point home that without that metadata, this doesn't work. You need to have that metadata there. Next question. Oh, you meant manual lens. Sorry. Yeah. So not completely automatic lens. The question meant a manual lens. So yeah. So we that's the question that we answered before. So Lens Baby will not work. That is correct. Lens Baby would not work. But even more to the point, Lens Baby wouldn't work as well because the whole nature of a Lens Baby is that you can completely distort the image. So A, you wouldn't want to remove the distortion, which is a big part of what the lens correction does. But no, that's right. You also do not get the denoising capabilities of that. It does need both of those pieces in there to do that. Why are the DNGs bigger files? Great question. Okay. So again, you are processing a file that starts off as a RAW, whether it's a CR2 or an NEF or whatever your camera makes, and the output is a DNG. Those DNG files can be up to 3 times the size of the original RAW, which is important. There's a couple reasons for this. The primary thing is that there's an RGB, I can get the right, if I get the terminology, I might get the terminology wrong, but an RGB full resolution RGB file that is created inside of there versus the raw data that is versus the raw data that is all that is in a regular raw file, just a normal raw file on its own. The DNG has this full RGB render of it. So it's as if you had opened up the file and rendered out a TIFF. Even though it is not a TIFF, it is still that same level of data. And those files, if you open up a file in Photoshop and you just save it out as a TIFF, the file will be bigger, considerably bigger. That's just the nature of RAW versus a rasterized file. It is largely the same thing, but it is still raw data. That's about the best that I can explain it. I know that an actual engineer could explain that better, but that is effectively it. You are getting a considerably larger file, which is why, even though we've talked about the possible workflow of processing all of your files through here, most users aren't going to do that because data, storage, while cheap these days, is not infinite or free. And so you probably want to be a bit selective about it. And so for the most case, for most users, the most common workflow is going to be processing individual images that will really benefit from this processing. You may process images through where you look at the difference and you go, okay, it's better, but I don't care. Or it's not better enough to make it worthwhile, or the image is just going to be shared on Instagram at a tiny little size versus the original size, and by that point you can't tell the difference anyway, so you don't bother, and that's perfectly fine. But for those photos where it really matters, for the photos where you really want to get the most out of it, that's where PureRAW comes into play. Okay, let's take a look at a few other photos in here. Alrighty, let's see here. I've got a bunch to compare. This is kind of funny. This is the cheapest lens that I could find in my collection. This is a shot on a Nikon D7000 with an 18 to 200 millimeter f3.5 to 5.6 lens. So I shouldn't even say cheapest because I have no idea what that lens costs, but anything that's got that massive zoom range and that variable aperture that much is not going to be a very good lens. That's just the nature of it. So this is about the worst lens photo that I could find in my collection. And this was, when was the shot? This was forever ago, God, 2011, 20 years ago. All right, 20-year-old photo. So let's pan around this photo and take a look at what we've got in here. We've got a, I'm going to guess that the focus was on her. Even that's debatable. No excuses here. We can see we obviously see that this is brick. We see some nice texture in here, but it's a bit soft. It is definitely a bit soft in here. It's not high ISO, it's only ISO 160, so we're not dealing with noise in here, but this is, not the sharpest photo in the bunch. All right, now let's look at a comparison. Let me just go straight into the compare mode in here, and I want to get the right comparison up. nope, there, and then there we go. Okay. So now, as we do the comparison here, I can zoom in close and pan these around. Actually, let me just zoom out. You know, I think, hold on, sorry, I'm gonna go back to this way, because this way I can go back and forth like this. You can more clearly see the distortion there. So there you can see the distortion difference. There's your original NEF, and there is the process file. So let's first just focus on the distortion. It's kind of funny, you don't always necessarily see it when you're looking at the original. You know, you look at this building here, that line there, and you go, okay, well, it's leaning in, so whatever, there's just a little perspective shift in there. But then you look at the corrected one, you go, oh, no, actually the camera was probably pretty level there. It's just that there was that much distortion in the lens. You see the pin cushioning happening in the middle there. So that's a pretty dramatic difference in there on its own. Right now, let's do a close-up comparison and do a side-by-side of the difference in here. And here you are seeing quite a nice difference there in the level of sharpness. Definitely, even though there didn't seem to be that much noise, we are seeing less noise in the file, and just in general getting a cleaner, sharper image out of that, which is nice. I mean, look at that. Look at the detail and the rock in here versus on this side here. Let's look at her face and see what we're getting on her face. Again, not the sharpest image in the beginning in the first place, but her skin looks better. The details on her face look nicer and smoother. That belt buckle is sharper. Let's look at the grass. Yep, the grass, we can see a lot more detail in the grass on the left. There's, you know, pretty notable difference in here between the two sides, which is, oh, there's a good one. Look at the statue up here, the detail on that versus on the left. So again, looking at those older photos, you do see quite a big difference in there. Let's see, let's go to this comparison. This comparison next. Again, this is a very wide lens. This is that 14mm aspherical lens, so it's designed to minimize distortion. The camera is held relatively level, but you still see a significant pin cushioning removal in here. You also see the devignetting around the edge, where the center of the brightness in the center of the photo versus the edges here, there's a noticeable difference. We go to this version of it, the DNG version, and that difference is removed, or at least largely eliminated. Look at the balcony, the walkway across the top. So looking at this line across here, it looks almost bent. But if we look at the DNG, the straightened one, it is nice and straight and pure. So really a huge difference in there as well. It's one of those, I shouldn't say huge. It's a subtle difference, but it makes a big difference. It does make a significant change. All right, let's see here. Let's do another couple photos here. This one, let's see, there's the original RAW. Oh, I must have really liked this lens. This is another with the 14mm, so very wide lens. This is shot at not super high ISO, 640, but this is shot at night. And if we zoom in close, it's was a 5D Mark II, so not massively high resolution file in here, but we can see the stars in here along with the noise. And I opened this file. I don't have a whole lot of star photos in my collection, but this one had some stars in it. And I wanted to show you what happens when we process a image with stars in it. This has come up quite a bit in my Q&As before. Let me actually zoom into 200% on this. You can see, obviously, there's the stars where you can see the little moving stars, but then you also see a lot of noise in there. Now let's go to the DNG version of that and see how much cleaner that is. Again, we're at 200% here, and you can see there is a significant difference in there, and still cleaning up the noise without cleaning up the stars in there. Now, it'd be a better example if the stars weren't moving, but I just didn't have that in my collection. But if especially zoomed out here as we go back and forth, you can really see that difference in there. All the stars are still there, but it is a remarkably cleaner looking file, which is pretty great. I'm going to jump over to the questions again. There's a couple more that have come up in here that we want to address. First one, can you show the difference between prime and DeepPRIME with the same shot side by side? Sure, I can do that. I'll come back to that. Next question is, do I get denoising with a manual lens in Photolab? No. So same thing in Photolab. You will not get prime denoising with a manual lens in Photolab. It's the same idea. You need to have that full metadata there. Okay, let's do prime and DeepPRIME side by side. I think I have a photo here. Yep, I have this one here that I haven't processed. I actually used this same photo for a prime versus DeepPRIME comparison when DeepPRIME first came out. So it'd be kind of fun to revisit this. So let's see, let's take that photo and jump over to PureRAW, drop that one in there. I'm gonna need to download the optics module for that. And let's see here. I actually, it's kind of interesting. I don't know what's gonna happen if I render it once and then render it again, if it's going to overwrite the file or not. I actually don't know. Let's see. So DeepPRIME, we're going to start with that. So we'll process that and let that render through. We'll give that a moment to do its thing. And then I think just to be safe, so we don't have to redo it again, I'm going to rename the output of this so that we don't accidentally rename. So I'm going to go to the Finder, and there's that file. Let's do this in list view. Oh, it does say DeepPRIME next to it. Okay, so we've already got that named DeepPRIME. Now let's see if I do a process again, set it to prime, and process that. Hopefully it just names it -prime and we don't get an overriding, and we'll have both of those side by side. If not, then I will have to redo it, but that's okay. All right, and that is almost done. There we go. Let's go to the Finder and see, did I get both? Yep, DxO Prime and DeepPRIME. Perfect. There we go. Awesome. Okay, that did work. So back over to Lightroom Classic. I'm going to use the trick that the other person had suggested. We'll just go to the DxO folder and we'll synchronize that. And it's going to bring in those two new missing files, or two new files, I should say. Imports those. There they are side by side. Let's go back to this. And here we go. So let's see here. That is the original. That is Prime, and that is DeepPRIME. Perfect. All right, let's open this up. So we're going to go from original. Let's go into 100% zoom. This is kind of ridiculous. Prime, DeepPRIME. That's huge. I mean, I love this example. Let me find another spot of the photo here. Difference between Prime and DeepPRIME is remarkable. And then, of course, going to the original is almost unfair. And that will pan to a different part of the image. How do I get it to, I wanted to not change the zoom point. Let's see, if I zoom out and zoom back in, I think that'll work. Let's go for this bottle here. It keeps moving it over, sorry. I don't know how to make it not do that. There we go. I mean, huge difference. So just to compare Prime and DeepPRIME, there's those two. Look at the wood texture. So that's DeepPRIME, that's Prime, DeepPRIME, Prime. Let's look at, let's see this label here. DeepPRIME, there we go, DeepPRIME, Prime, DeepPRIME, Prime, just to drive the point to the original. Oh, the original. I mean, it's a crazy difference. Look here, here's a great example. Look at the text on here. You can read this. If I go to DeepPRIME, yeah, where'd it go? You can almost kind of read it. I go to the original, you can't read it. Like, look at the difference there. I mean, just between Prime and DeepPRIME, that is fantastic, just fantastic. Love it. So there, good, thank you. Good question. I'm glad I could answer that for you. There's more questions popping up. I'm just going to focus on the questions here. So my images originally imported and converted to a DNG by Lightroom, PureRAW can still work with the image. Yes. So this is something we tested in the last webinar because I didn't know the answer to that one either. As long as it is a supported camera and lens combination, of course. If you have previously imported a RAW file into Lightroom and told it to convert to a DNG on import, you can still take that Lightroom converted DNG and bring that into PureRAW, and it will process and re-output another DNG, just the same as if it was a native RAW file. So yes, that does work. Again, the camera and lens combination still has to be supported because it is looking for that metadata. So it's not like that's a tricky workaround to get it to support non-supported systems. You do still have to do that. Next question, with an unsupported camera like the Fuji X-Pro 2, if you convert it to a DNG, will DeepPRIME be able to process it? So no, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. It still needs that original metadata. And the reason, so Fuji X-Pro 2, that's the X-Trans processor, X-Trans sensor. It's a totally different sensor type, and this is something that DxO gets asked of DxO a lot. I don't have any insight into what may or may not be happening in the future, but I will tell you that, I'll tell you two things. Number one, DxO knows that a lot of people who shoot Fuji would like to be able to use this. Number two, if your camera is not supported, ask for it. Even though you go, I know a million people have already asked for it, B million and one, ask for it. I'm talking to you as a photographer, as a consumer who uses a lot of different apps and services out there. One thing I have learned over my decades of working with it in this industry is you don't get what you don't ask for. And the more people that ask for something, the more likely it is to be done. Even though DxO knows that a particular camera and lens combination might be wanted, if only 5 people ask for it, they're going to go, well, it might not be worth it because only 5 people want it. If 500 people ask for it, then they go, oh, well, there's actually some real interest in this. They don't know unless you ask. And the more people that ask, the more likely something is to be supported. So even though you may have asked before, even though you know that other people have asked, ask for it. The best way to do that is to go to that website that I mentioned in the beginning, where you see the supported camera and lens combinations. In fact, let me just pull that up, because I think this is a really good thing to show. Let me open a new web page here, DxO.com/ let's see if I got the URL right, supported cameras. I did. Let's bring this over here. So here's the supported camera list. We'll see in here, you can just search for whatever camera. So like I'm a Lumix shooter, right? So I'll type in Lumix, and oh, nope, I'm gonna type in Panasonic. There we go, Panasonic, and then I choose like, what's my camera model, or I can just type in the camera model. I can go like S5, I choose on the S5. Yep, the S5, Panasonic S5 supported. So there's how you find it. And then you can go look at the view the lens modules, and it'll tell you on that camera what lens combinations are supported with it. So that's how that whole thing works. Anyway, you go down to the bottom and it says your hardware is not supported, make a suggestion. You click that, you fill out the form in there, and off you go. So that's how that works. So do it, do it, do it, do it, do it. It can't hurt. Is there a shortcut to send my older DNG files from Lightroom to PureRAW and then back into Lightroom? Looks like I need to find the original file in Finder and then import it into Lightroom by PureRAW. Will there be an update to the user interface? So if you're using a Mac, then you can just drag and drop it over. If you're using Windows, then Reveal in Finder is the method to do that. I don't know if there's any plans to add a module to export to a send to module. I know that has been talked about. People have asked about that before. I don't know if there's any plans to do that or not. But right now, the process is a drag and drop workflow, drag and drop interface. Okay. All right, we got a few more minutes here. That was the last question that's up right now. If you have any more questions, get them in now. In the meantime, I'm going to look for another before and after image to show you. Yeah, let's go to this one here. This is one of those that's not a massive difference. This is a photo. This was shot of a interior of a home for sale, and let's see, this is shot on a GH5 on the 7 to 14 millimeter lens. So it's not a great lens. The 7 to 14 was the widest lens that I had at the time. It's not as good as the newer 8 to 18 millimeter, but the 7 to 14, it's a reasonable wide angle, very wide angle lens. You can see minimal distortion around the edges. It looks pretty good. But as we look at the processed file, we're seeing a couple things happening in here. So there's the processed version, there's the original. One of the differences that we see here is the amount of detail, amount of data around the edge. Here's the original. Look at where this curtain cuts off. See, it goes up and it cuts off. And we don't see this part of the curtain, yet on the DNG file you do. So before, after, before, after. You're actually getting more in the photo. And this is a really important point. Quite often, this is just going to depend on your lens and camera you're shooting with. Quite often, you end up with more pixels, more file, more photo around the edges of the photo once it's processed, because the way that the distortion correction is happening is actually superior to what was built in or happening natively, and you actually get more files out of it, which is pretty cool. That's, if we look at the very much the highlight areas on here, these kind of blown out areas in here, you'll see on the original here, we're not really getting a lot of distortion, a lot of chromatic aberration, but there is a little bit. You can see a little bit down that bright edge there and a little bit along this edge here. I go to the DNG though, and that is cleaned up. It is significantly cleaned up. We see that it just looks better. And it's kind of one of those where you look at this, you go, yeah, that's fine. But then you look at that one, you go, oh, it is better. Yep, before, oops, after, move that over. Before, after, yeah, it is better. And even, look, there's noise in there. Oop, it's gone. What was this shot at? 400. I bet there's noise. Now it's not. So remarkable, really, truly remarkable what the differences are in there. All right, looks like there's no more questions coming up. I'm going to call it a wrap. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in today. I'll see you whenever the next one is. I'm not even sure, but there's one coming up. I guarantee it. Take care. Bye-bye.